Let's go with because it's history. To the Europeans, the groups on the continent were barbarians or savages. Europe considered itself the pinnacle of civilization. And if we add to this trait of superiority the fact that they saw these people dressed in modest ways, since they showed a lot of their bodies and even women with their breasts exposed, it was evident that they were savage and uncultured beings. However, today there are groups that are supposedly more advanced than others, or that have different lifestyles. And that does not mean we can consider some as savages. For example, Cristiano Ronaldo is one of the most famous players of our time. And he has all the money in the world, all the luxuries, all access to the best things and technology on the planet. But in the same era, we see these groups in Africa who continue to live and dress as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. They have none of what the soccer player has, nor his lifestyle. And so, could we say that Cristiano Ronaldo is a civilized person, while the other are backward or savage? Of course not. They are completely different contexts that cannot be compared. Nor can we make value judgments about their beliefs, lifestyles, and needs. This applied to all Europeans who arrived here, but in the clash of cultures, something funny happened. For what was not convenient for the Spanish, they will say that these people were idolaters and savages. But on the other hand, they saw things that in their words were wonders. For example, they said that Tenochtitlan was the beans of the New World. They had never seen anything like the market of Tlatelolco and many other things that amazed them. And on the other hand, they said they were very backward. So, let's make a comparative analysis of the achievements of European cultures with the achievements of these lands. Among these cultures, there were differences, as not all had the same development, nor did they do things the same way. However, they had more or less homogeneous aspects that will surface in this comparison. The Europeans referred to themselves as very cultured, but the reality is that very few people in Europe knew how to read and write. Receiving a formal education was preserved for very few people, mostly the wealthy. But here among the Mexicas, all children received at least a basic education, and if in Europe the places where education took place were almost exclusively convents, here there were schools called Calmecac and Tepochcali, where a minimum education was guaranteed for everyone. Not leaving the educational aspect, in Europe they boasted of having libraries with books. Well, here there were also books, of course not in the European format that is still used today. These books are now called codices, which converted various subjects and topics such as history, herbal medicine, mathematical and astronomical calculations, rituals, among many other subjects. It is estimated that their number was certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Housed in places that among the Nawas were called a moshkali or house of codices. That is to say, the European equivalent of libraries. Here, there were no animals that could be trained as beasts of burden, except for llamas and alpacas in South America. Therefore, The use of the wheel was not very functional, although there is evidence that they knew of it. In Europe, many roads were inherited from the Romans. But here, with the new discoveries of technologies like LIDAR in many Mayan areas still covered by the jungle, countless roads have been found. And the clearest example of this consciousness of communication and connection of places is the road network of the Tahuantinsuyo, or Pac-Ñan, used by the Incas. Some researchers even suggest that groups prior to the Incas started these road constructions. These were later taken up by the Incas. The savages had laws just like in Europe. Like any culture in history, they sought to self-regulate to avoid falling into chaos. And they had rules of behavior and of course sanction if someone broke them. The most known example is Nezahualcóyotl, from whom some laws that regulate both of the noble class and the general populace survived. There were penalties for theft, abuse of power, drunkenness, to name just a few examples. There were even specialized judges to conduct trials and, if necessary, enforce the laws. One topic often referred to as an example of culture is poetry, with many examples among the Greeks, Romans, and many others. But here, too, there was poetry, again invoking the poet king, but not only him. There were many poems that have survived to this day. Not to mention singing, dancing, and music, which are categorized as fine arts. There were also accounting systems, some of which are still very difficult to understand today. An example is the Kiput and Yupana, Inca mathematical instruments used for accounting, trade operations, and common teaching. Over today, there are theories that some of these objects also served as alphabets. Ascertaining colors of the stands will help from words. These groups, specifically the largest ones, had armies where, or thought, most were not composed of people solely dedicated to war like the Roman legends. These armies had hierarchies, ranks, uniforms, battle insignias, and their warfare could even be considered more civilized than in Europe. As many times, the conflicting groups would conference to set a date and place for battles. There is evidence of the intelligence and very elaborated work in inhalating objects in feet. That we now call herbal medicine, or even New Age fashion consisting of the use of plants, was a subject used by all these peoples. Although they did not have the answer of all diseases, the specialist has extensive knowledge of plants to treat most ailments or diseases. What we now call calendars. Of course, they had with the Mayans having one of the most precious in history. And although Pope Gregory XVIII, in the year 1582, had to adjust the Julian calendar as it was already out of the sync, the groups in these lands has already solved this time discrepancy problem thousands of years before. Their specialists also had perfectly regulated the movement of the stars and visible planets, knowing about astronomical alignments and even eclipses. In terms of infrastructure and cities, there were some of the largest cities in the world, like Teotihuacan, which was perfectly laid out and planned with a drainage system. And in the Mayan lands, they have also found cities with thousands of constructions that had water storage and purification systems, like Tikal, as well as a population of 5,000, 100,000, or more. Whereas in Europe, only a few cities had that many people. And let's not talk about hygienic conditions, which although they do not compare to current conditions where we all have a bathroom at home. Their cities had for the time high sanitation standards, unlike Europe, where most cities, if not all, were dirty and generator of many diseases and pandemics. There was also a social structure in the more development groups where there were noble classes and unit rulers. Some similar to the current president and vice president shared power like the Mexicas with the Tlatoani and the Chihuacoatl. There were also ruling dynasties of families. And of course, we know much of this because they also had very elaborate writing systems like the Mayans. Similar to the Egyptians, they had leaves that represent syllabus, which together formed words, writing that we see everywhere. Now, about being naked, the fact that they did not wear things, funny hats, dresses like haircuts, tents, didn't make them uncivilized. On the contrary, many of their weapons were writing in themselves, as their embroidery, and even the colors used contained messages, stories, myths, and legends, known only to those members of the community. This still happens even today. They also have belief systems, where, like in Europe, they worship beings they had never seen. And many were artists, creating works like this. Of course, all this does not mean that all the inhabitants of the continent were wise, enlightened, knowledgeable in arts and science. Far from it. As we said at the beginning, each group has more development, skilled or wealthy members than others. But it does show that no group on the continent divided anything from the European culture of that time. Simply, each continent did things according to the context that surrounded them. So, were the savages here? The truth is no. Of course, if it is just to disqualify, the savages will always be the others, not us. And so, they were judged by the Europeans of that time.